Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. We welcome you to Book Sandwich Tin. First, a bit of housekeeping. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. We are live streaming the formal portion of today's program to the library's YouTube channel at Rochester Public Library, New York. If you need to access the induction loop service in the auditorium, please adjust your hearing aid to the T switch. A bit of background. Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library, FFRPL, expands the Rochester Public Library's community impact through fundraising, marketing, and programming. We also manage restricted funds that provide supplemental materials support to 62 eligible libraries in Monroe, Ontario, Wayne, Livingston, Orleans, and Genesee counties. A bit of context and a reminder. Libraries are for everyone. On Friday, March 14th, the Trump administration issued an executive order calling for the elimination of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the nation's only federal agency for America's libraries. In response, the New York State Library issued a statement including this excerpt, quote, "Threats to this institution are a threat to the state's history and the fundamental principles of democracy, which rely on an informed public and free access to information. Libraries are not merely symbols of equity, access, and opportunity. They are the driving force behind those values in every community across our state." The American Library Association, ALA, responded as well. Quote, "As seedbeds of literacy and innovation, our nation's 125,000 public, school, academic, and special libraries deserve more, not less support. Libraries of all types translate 0.003% of the federal budget into programs and services used in more than 1.2 billion in-person patron visits every year, and many more virtual visits." You can visit the American Library Association's website, ala.org, for frequently asked questions about the executive order, as well as links to contact your senators and representatives, urging them to overturn the executive order and protect IMLS funding. FFRPL stands in solidarity with the staff, administration, volunteers, board members, patrons, donors, and advocates who are committed to the viability of our libraries. Today is Library Giving Day. FFRPL is fundraising to purchase supplemental startup equipment and materials for RPL Go, the new mobile library. RPL Go supports the library's mission to engage the community in lifelong learning through equal access to information, technology, and expert staff. Visit ffrpl.org to learn more and donate to the project. Today, John Getz will review Framed, Astonishing True Stories of Wrongful Convictions by John Grisham and Jim McCloskey. Best-selling novelist John Grisham's real-life passion for justice led to his work with Jim McCloskey for Centurion Ministries, the first organization dedicated to exonerating innocent people who have been wrongfully convicted. The 10 true stories in Framed expose prevalent injustices in our criminal justice system, as well as the racism and corruption that make wrongful convictions so difficult to reverse. Mr. Getz is an attorney and certified federal court mediator in the Rochester region. He's also the past director of the Innocence and Justice Project at University of Buffalo School of Law. Please welcome Mr. Getz to our podium.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, FFRPL. And I have to admit, I feel like I'm cheating you all because I could stand here for hours and hours and hours about talking about these matters. And for my friends who are here that know me, There's three things you need to know, and for those who don't, they know this already. Three things. I love to read. That's a passion of mine. I love to talk. It's a passion of mine. And I love the issue of addressing justice. And it's a passion of mine. And I've been doing this work for over 30 years now. And it's been a privilege to do this, and it's truly a privilege to be here this afternoon with everybody. I'd like to take a moment before we begin talking about the book. I had volunteered some nice folks in front to pass around. It's not a handout. It's just to pass around to each other and look at it. 2 pictures. And the reason I decided to do this with friends that are here, for the friends that are watching online or later, these 2 photographs, I had the opportunity and the honor in 2017 to attend the Innocence Project. They have an annual conference, and this was in San Diego. And it was the year that they were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Innocence Project. And it was very powerful because what they did was, there's 2 pictures that will go around. One of the photographs shows a bunch of men and some women on a podium. And then all of those people, by the way, were wrongfully convicted and were in prison. Why is this important? The second picture shows how long those people had been incarcerated wrongfully. 2,953 years collectively, with 222 years of the people on death row, all wrongfully convicted. Actual innocence. And I think it's powerful because I'd suggest to you that it segues into this book. No wrong answers here. This is just a show of hands. Who thought this was an easy read? Good answers. Who thinks this is a happy read? Thank you. And there's no wrong answers. And I'm going to kind of join you with this later on because it's very powerful, and you have to bear with me because my biases are, I've really been doing this a long time. For good or for bad, I've met people who have gone through these very same things. And what I find remarkable is the hope that they give. And I'd like to end when we get to the point where you're all done with me, I'll end with some of the hope and things that we can talk about to make some changes after questions as well. But I think it's powerful to understand these are real people. This really happened. And for those of you who do fiction, read a lot of fiction, which I also do. Shameless plug, Edward Ashton is a local author. He wrote Mickey 7. Read the book. You'll enjoy it. But back to this. If you were to read this from a fictional perspective, how many people would actually believe some of these storylines, that it could actually happen? It seems so surreal, right? It happens more than we care to discuss. 4% of the people that are incarcerated are wrongfully convicted. That's just a statistical reality. It's amazing, and we'll talk about this in context of the book in a moment, but it's amazing how many of those people, 18% of the people wrongfully convicted, admitted to a crime they didn't commit. And when people start hearing that, it's like, how can that be? Well, I think what we have here is Grisham and McCluskey giving us the whys. How and the whys. Why does this happen? And I'll suggest that I read this, and I've admitted to some friends, I've read parts more than once, more than twice. I had to take breaks. I viewed this after reading 2 chapters in a row. I think my wife thought I might have a heart attack because I started to get pumped up and reading this. And I said, you know what, I'll read this as separate stories, take a little break. I suggested that to other friends that were reading this book as well because it's very powerful. And I think that the reason, I don't mean to jump to chapter 10, but that chapter 10, in my mind, is the most brutal part of the book, as opposed to giving us some hope. They're kicking us after really punching us over and over and over again with the problems. not only an innocent man who was executed, but for a crime that never happened. Never mind that a crime that he did not commit, but a crime that never happened. And I think that there's a very good reason that they did this. Those of us who like to give hope, I would have liked to have maybe ended it on a happier note so that we could talk. But we'll get to that later in the context. I also think that again, just my suggestions, and I look forward to the questions later on from friends that are here, but I would suggest that there's a reason that they picked these 10 stories out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who have had these things happen to them. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I could spend hours talking about just their stories alone, and each one is a story. But I think it goes to these central themes of what causes wrongful conviction. Why does this happen? And I think if you've read this, you all get where I'm coming from, so I apologize. But you see, I'll call it junk science, my word. You see things like that. Prosecutorial or police misconduct, misidentification, high-profile matters, getting back to the issue of people giving false confessions. Those are some of the core issues that you see repeatedly. And I think some of these particular stories really hammer that home. A case that I was hoping we would have even more information on is on Chapter 5, and that's unknown male. And I'm sorry that I'm starting kind of in the middle of the book, but this is my bias. I've really been an attorney for a long time, and those of you who know what I do, I kind of get in the weeds. So I'll show you. I'm a sticky note guy, and I do that for a reason, because that's how I was trained. And the reason I had to read parts of this book over again was not to read it from a lawyer's eyes, but as a human being's eyes who hasn't seen that, to hopefully have these connections today. That said, from an attorney perspective, the case that actually drove me the craziest was Chapter 5, which is titled Unknown Male. And for those who had an opportunity to get to that chapter, it talks about 3 men who were wrongfully convicted. Never mind the very dubious witness testimony. There's really no witnesses. These were people who said that I said something happened. It's not a witness, but that's for another day. What do we know about Chapter 5, though, in Unknown Male, is we know that Henrietta Nitkin's murder, and I do not mean to mispronounce her name, had incredibly valuable evidence right there, DNA evidence. And it was in places, and I'm not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty details, but it was clear in my mind, having done this for as long as I have, that would be your first look. You look at the forensics, and where the DNA evidence was found would lead any reasonable investigator, of which I know many excellent investigators, as a matter of fact, to say, we've got to get this DNA tested, and we've got to do some matching. Because in today's world, the database is huge. It is huge. And if you remember, at the end of this storyline in Chapter 5, they talk about those 3 gentlemen. They're out right now. But the prosecutor, this is in Pennsylvania, the prosecution had appealed the last decision of the trial court for their release. And there was kind of a hope by me that maybe that we'd have a decision that I could chat with you about today. It's not out yet. But the one thing we do know is from everything, and again, this is me digging into a little deeper than in the book itself. Today, it does not still appear that the prosecution has done a DNA check in the database. I find that to be polite, remarkable. How does that happen in today's world? And I suggest that the reason that Mr. Grisham and Mr. McCluskey took that one is really that twofold. You have, well, actually three points. You have police who kind of just wanted to get this solved, and it seems kind of unreal when you look at, there's no motive for these three gentlemen. There's no, I mean, frankly, I think they had some pretty solid alibis. But we also know something about these three gentlemen. They were poor, and they were people of color. And those are also, I remember how I was talking about those topics before, of how these happen for wrongful convictions. When you all have a chance to have looked at that podium shot, significant majority of those men are African Americans, and they're poor. And I am not in any way disparaging public defenders or defensive counsel. I was in the Monroe County Public Defender's Office when I started. I've done defense work at the federal and state levels at the reduced rates. So those people work hard, but they don't necessarily have the same resources. And you certainly can't fix lies unless somebody comes forward and says, I lied. And you certainly can't go and fix hiding of evidence, because if you don't know what you don't know from a defense attorney perspective, and if it's being hidden, what do you do with that, right? And you certainly can't fix the government, and this is no disrespect to friends in again, I have friends who are prosecutors too, but when you get somebody who is so focused on getting that conviction that they will do anything, and I think we all saw that in a number of these stories. What do? You are then going up against the state. The other reason that I picked Chapter 5 to start our conversation was in Chapter 5, you can see, in my opinion, the problems with the criminal justice process, institutionally speaking. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are charged with a crime, you have what's called speedy trial, and there's the process moves relatively quickly. You also have the pursuit of justice, and you want the government to get the bad people off the streets and do whatever punishment needs to be done. But that's a good thing. Societally speaking, that's a good thing. The problem is that the government, in many instances, the institutions, in many instances, refuse to admit that they were wrong, even when it's right in their face. There's a mistake here. We're wrong. And think about how many years, and again, decades in many of these stories, where they fought tooth and nail to keep that conviction upheld. And I find that problematic from my bias, which is that of a criminal defense attorney or a defense attorney. I just think, no, if you're a prosecutor, your job is to do justice. And if the evidence shows it didn't happen, you say, hold on, let's get this fixed and get these people out as quickly as possible so it doesn't take 12, 15, 25, 30 years to get them out. Because I would suggest, just as important as it is for society to get the people who have committed crimes to be held accountable, society suffers greatly when somebody's wrongfully imprisoned or wrongfully convicted. The victims aren't just the individuals who are suffering this, but also their families and loved ones. The victims and the victims of the families of the victims as well, right? Because if there was in fact a murder, and I say it that way because we know in Chapter 10 a crime didn't even occur, but if there was in fact a homicide or a murder, the victim's family doesn't get true justice, and most importantly, this sounds maybe strange for me to be saying this, but most importantly, society is suffering, right? As a society, we've done that person wrong, and we've never held the person or people who committed the crime accountable. And I see that as so very important. And so when I started with Chapter 5, it may have sounded goofy to you all to begin, but I hope you understand why I started there. I'd then like to go, because again, these themes, we'll jump back to chapter 1. and I'm going to apologize because with the time that we have, I'm not going to be able to get through all of the chapters. These are just when I was reviewing this, thinking, okay, if I were sitting where my friends are sitting today, what would they want to hear from Getz? So that's what I'm doing for you. And I think that they picked the Norfolk 4 for a number of reasons as well in chapter 1. And I think that it's because it set a stage for all of the things that can happen when people, because think about how crazy that story is, right? You have 4 people, you sit there and say, there's absolutely there's absolutely no evidence that linked these sailors to the crime. Just like, by the way, and maybe this is a good segue, just like for the soldiers, the 3 soldiers that were on the bachelor party, and you know the chapter I'm referencing, kind of the same idea. These folks, like some of these sailors, were not only on duty, they weren't underway, but they were on their ships. And yet, the investigators, for whatever reason, got it into their heads that this was some huge conspiracy of criminal behavior that really defied the forensics. And you'll hear me use that word a lot because I am kind of a forensic guy. You find a footprint, if the footprint's not lying, it's how you interpret it, but if there's a footprint there, there's a footprint there, right? The fingerprints or DNA, as long as it's not been tampered with, it's there. But you know, you look at this and say, it gave us, and my suggestion is the central themes by getting right to the heart of the matter with some of the systemic flaws. Because it didn't just address the issues of how could this happen from the wrongful conviction portion, but we know that what happened to those 4 men and more, I mean, there's more than 4 people that were really involved in this incident, that justice was not served. And I'd suggest that that's quite troubling. And we know now, or I would suggest that we know that what Mr. McCluskey and Mr. Grisham are doing is intentional, to make us feel ill at ease and uncomfortable about what's happening and to pay attention. And sometimes the nice way isn't the best way to have that happen. And that first storyline, you're sitting there, I read it anyway and thought, if I didn't know the case, because I actually knew about this case, if I didn't know the case, I'm like, no, this isn't real, right? And you have to bear with me because I have a strange sense of humor. Sometimes when I was reading parts of the book, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but anybody here ever see the movie My Cousin Vinny? Okay. I love that movie. I've actually used it when I was teaching to help people because there's some good points to it. But the reason I'm bringing that up is there's the one scene where they're trying to get him to admit to shooting the store clerk. And it's like, well, so when did you shoot? You know, he's talking about the tuna fish, right? The can of tuna. And I shot the store clerk? I shot the store. Well, he said he shot the store clerk. Here it is. He said that 3 times. And in many of these instances, I would suggest we're seeing that too, or just out and outright bullying, you know, and lying. We see, and by the way, it is perfectly legal in most states and for federal authority, federal law enforcement, to lie to you during interrogations. It is legal. Okay? Massachusetts is currently in the process of perhaps having a statute which changes that. And we'll talk more about that at the very end, and I know my time is moving rapidly. Did I mention I like to talk? But I think that they wanted to get these parts out about coercing confessions, how the evidence doesn't fit the theme that whoever came up with. And then with this one, it's just like, and again, I don't want to be, we're in a public library, there's many people who may watch this, there's parts of this and you're like, wait a minute, that's insane. And yet it went through, and these people went to prison. Since we're rapidly running out of time, the other two points that I wanted, two chapters I wanted to get to was 9 and 10, and I don't mean to, because all of these people have some very, very amazing stories, and they're quite sad, but they're also quite hopeful. And what I mean by that is when you looked at the middle of the book with the pictures of where these folks are now, and you can just see that resilience of humanity, it's impressive to me. Don't they kick us in the gut on chapter 10, where a crime didn't get committed? And by the way, I actually, clinically speaking, we have been talking about the fire science that was used in there for decades now, not years, but before this ever happened. There's problems here. There are real problems with how that works, because it's not science. It's kind of this, well, it's always been done this way theme. And that's certainly not scientific. I am fortunate enough to have an amazing wife who is a scientist. Her only downside is her choice of spouses. But at the end of the day, scientific method means something to scientists. There was no scientific method utilized. It was just, well, we have a hunch because of the way it might be. And we will get to questions in a little bit. And sure, chapter 10 is a story about a gentleman who ended up, let me get to it, he ended up being wrongfully convicted of an arson in which his family died in the fire. This happened in Texas. And that's, oh, by the way, I'm not trying to pick on Texas, but if you ever have a Texas Ranger come to your door, ask for a lawyer right away. I think they got that point across real quick, too. But it went from a very tragic storyline about what happened, and then all of a sudden these investigators thought, again, my bias, I don't think that they would have ever have thought that of me, because I am a more privileged white person. But he was a poor man. He was Caucasian, and they turned him into an animal who killed his family, murdered his children. Now, the preface of this is when this fire happened, he literally ran back into the fire to try to save these kids' lives and almost died himself. Okay, but you look at what happened here, and there was just, again, so much going on where even the investigators were starting to question themselves, and yet the process put him to death. And I just found that, and the reason I said that was a gut punch was because, to me, you kind of want to end a book with some sort of like, well, here are all the people we've been able to help, this was going on, and they kind of do that. But you'd want to hear maybe one where it was a little bit more hopeful, but this poor man died, so you have all of these victims. And by the way, the forensics, the real forensics showed there was no arson. It was an accidental fire, and these people died tragically. But it shows what happens when the weight of an institution can come in. Since we're running out of time, I'm happy to answer questions later. That said, I do think, again, when you look at this, it is not just based upon, when you look at this book, the other themes that were relied upon was not just considering the issues involving people who have limited means or are poor. And I think the perfect example of that was the man who was convicted of murdering his wife. I think that was chapter 8. Since I'm going, and in that particular case, at the time of the homicide, he was probably 2.5 hours away. And again, they just got it into their minds, yet again in Texas, where they found they just thought that he was a closeted gay man who decided to just inexplicably murder his wife, and he spent, again, decades in prison for that. And I'm sorry, because it looks like I've run out of, I'm good? Okay. What I'll go through then is since I've got a little bit more time, and I'll take it, is that hope part and what I think the writers were trying to do with this book, and I think succeeded, which was to show people who read it, and thank you all for reading, who have read it. For those who haven't, I really encourage you, or if you haven't finished it, I encourage you, take your time. It's a heavy book. But go back, because what they're really, I think, getting at is shining light in the need for advocacy and reform in our criminal justice system. Okay? And I'm going to be honest, I'm a realist with these things. We're not talking about hard solutions. We're talking about very doable solutions to this. And I think, you know, when you have somebody as well known as John Grisham writing about it, it gives people like me an opportunity to stand up and to speak with people and friends like you to see what we can do. And the first thing I would say is you have voices, and 2 ears, 1 mouth. First of all, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 mouth. You can read and understand these things better and see how it impacts individuals. Second, you can listen to how can you make a difference. And third, most importantly, that mouth can be used to advocate for people who you may not even know, but I know everybody here deep in your gut thinks there's nothing worse than somebody wrongfully convicted. I really, think about it. Think about when you were children and you were, like, your mom or your dad, you didn't do it, somebody else did it, but you get punished for it, right? How did you feel? You felt pretty bad. Now, X factor that to what's happened here. And I think we would all understand that when you are able to really dive down into it, you can make a difference. And it's first by coming to events like this and bearing through somebody like me talking to you. And I hate this because I like to ask questions more often for people, so I like to be a little bit more engaging. And I have a friend in the back. I've got a lot of folks I know here who say, yeah, that's true. But my ask of you is going to be look and see what happens locally. Go wherever you want, but locally, and this isn't on the Monroe County District. When I say locally, I'm talking about the state, okay? Because for good or for bad, our communities have had numerous individuals who have been wrongfully convicted and frankly wrongfully accused with no evidence, or limited evidence, or falsified evidence, and or evidence that was hidden that was exculpatory in nature, evidence that proved innocence. And my ask for you is start looking. If you Google it, you'll see what I'm talking about. In New York State, this isn't heavy lawyer stuff here. There is a section of the criminal procedure law called 440, and if you Google it, you'll see what we're talking about. But what it is, it's one of the biggest tools used by attorneys in our state to have people who are wrongfully convicted released from prison. And in 2017, there was a decision by the New York State Court of Appeals called People versus Tiger, in which an individual, and this is actually in the book, not this case, but this segues into issues with the book. Miss Tiger was a home health aide, and she was taking care of a child who had significant health issues. And there was an initial thought, and this person ended up getting charged with a homicide, that she had killed this child. And they made an offer she couldn't refuse. She was looking at murder, and in New York State, murder is a minimum of 15 to life, typically 25 to life. They offered her a manslaughter charge with time served and probation. And she took a plea, even though she steadfastly had said she did not do this. Okay? Why is this important? Fast forward, New York State Court of Appeals, which is our highest court, said, and by the way, it comes back, no crime had occurred. Forensically speaking, this child died of natural causes. Miss Tiger had done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. And the New York State Court of Appeals, in a very technical argument, I'm not going to bore you with that, and I don't have the time to discuss it, but what they said was, my bias coming out, innocence doesn't matter. If you plead guilty, you're guilty, with a very limited exception. If DNA evidence proves that you are not the person, that DNA evidence can be used to exonerate you and have the judgment vacated. Any other scientific proof is not part of the statute, therefore, she's still guilty under the eyes of the law. Okay? And if you think about how many individuals that we read about pled guilty, and again, far be it from me, how many people, what would you do if they said, you can get out today if you plead guilty? Not my, and I've had those discussions with more clients than I can tell you about. Not my choice. I always respect it. But I'm also, two things, not as dumb as I look, which is quite believable, but I'm a little bit of a fighter. I think that's a good thing in what I do. But some of these people, they just want to move forward. And how can you not respect that if you've been in prison for 5 years? Literally be in your shoes, right? And suddenly you're looking at getting out. It's a lot easier to sit here when you're not chained. I think that if you all get engaged, you can look these things up. There has been a big push by people like me to get that statute changed so it's all forensic evidence. We're not trying to be unreasonable here. It's like, look, if science changes all the time and we can show scientifically speaking a crime wasn't committed, don't we want to get those people out of prison? And we've gone through over and over again through numerous legislative processes. Recently, the Assembly and the Senate had moved the bill. Unfortunately, Governor Hochul had vetoed it, and this is me getting a little snarky because in sum and substance she said it would mean more work for prosecutors if we had this go through. And I will not say what my initial response was, but my more academic response and justice response was, well, wait a minute. Two things you're forgetting. First, a prosecutor's job is to do justice, not to have a conviction. And second, I find it remarkable that anybody would stand up and say something like that when you know there's an innocent person in prison, but it'd be more work for somebody. That's not how our system is supposed to work. So always be vigilant and always remember what we're supposed to stand for as a country. And there's things you can do. So with that, I thank you so much for your time. I think we have some opportunities for questions.